literary treat. Our accomplished guest will be reading from his latest novel, In the Fabled East. This novel was selected by Amazon.ca as one of the best books of the year and was a finalist for the Commonwealth Regional Writers' Prize. The New Brunswick Reader hailed Adam as the next great Canadian writer. Please welcome Adam Lewis Schroeder.
Thank you for coming. There's lots of books hidden back here. Any book you want, you just reach it. There it is. It's a magic cabinet of books. I'm going to be talking today, as Tony said, about In the Fabled East. We'll go into great details over the afternoon. It's the story, in a nutshell, of a tubercular French woman named Adelaide Tremier, who in 1909 travels from Paris to French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in search of the secret of eternal life. She's very near dead from tuberculosis, and this is her last chance effort to save herself, then go back to carry on raising her 9-year-old son, Manu. Now that might seem like quite a random and very arbitrary course of action if you're dying of tuberculosis, but at one point in the novel she attends a lecture by the Left Bank Orientalist League in Paris, and they bandy around all these different theories about Asian immortality legends, and so this sort of plants a seed in her mind that if all else fails, she might actually pursue that course of action. And the book starts before we even meet Adelaide, long before we meet Adelaide. This is sort of a preface called The Fable of the Spring of Youth. Once a rich man was so miserly that he chose to live in the forest, apart from other families, and leaving on a hunt, he told his son, "Watch over my jar while I'm away, for it's our family's wealth." But the son fell ill with fever, so that monkeys were able to enter the house and take great sport in rolling the precious jar at the door. And because he was blustering and loud, the rich man was a poor hunter and caught nothing, and so returned home in a rage, and was so angry when he discovered the jar stolen that he dragged his poor son into the forest and raised his knife. And because he was pure of heart, this boy's last words were not, "I do not wish to die, but I wish that no one would die." And then his father left the little body unburned and unburied so wild beasts would devour it. But instead, the spirit of the water caused a spring to gush from the boy's mouth. And that night, the rich man's relations, hurrying to invite him to a feast, took their rest beside the spring. They were surprised, for in all their years of travel, they'd never seen one in that place. And they were no less surprised when they stumbled across the boy's body as they made camp. They could no longer recognize him as their nephew, so they agreed that they would make no funeral but simply burn the little body in the morning. They boiled water from the spring. They threw in their dried fish, and then the most surprising event of all occurred. Live fishes leaped from the kettle. The water of the spring, the relatives suspected, was rife with spirits. They splashed water on the murdered boy, and he sat up and through his mutilated lips described what his father had done. The enraged travelers raced through the night to find the rich man, and hearing their cries, he ran out of the house. But because he was blustering and loud, he blundered into a tiger's jaws, and afterward this tiger suffered incurable diarrhea. Meanwhile, the son discovered the jar where the monkeys had abandoned it, and with this recovered wealth, he founded a village below the spring. Of course, the rich man should have known that a family's wealth is not its jars, but its children. And that's our preface. Now, Adelaide, our protagonist, grows up in the south of France in the 1880s and 90s. And by the time she's 18, her brother and her parents have all died from various reasons. The book goes on into in some detail, but suffice to know, she's grown up with all these great old French folk tales that all seem to consist invariably, at some point, of an orphan going out to make their way in the world. And so that resonates a little bit with her in this next scene. So she goes up to Paris as an orphan to make her way in the world, and at Les Halles Market she meets a great strapping young man with a beautiful blonde mustache, because mustaches, were very important in 1898, named Nicolas Tremier, who's there to buy a crayfish the size of a watermelon. And they hit it off fairly well. They go for walks in the Luxembourg Gardens, and eventually he asks her out on an actual date. So this is that date. It was opening night of the opera Cendrillon at the Opera Comique, where the Tremier family's fourth-tier box looked down on the orchestra seats as though on a fiefdom.
while couples sat like tombstones in the adjoining velvet-lined boxes, the 100 diverse instruments of the pit tuned like a lot of train whistles and birds and blacksmith's bellows, and Adelaide leaned this way and that to see it all, until Nicola threw the curtain across, seized her by the waist, and pulled her onto his lap, so if only for a moment she'd keep still. Within the gloomy box, a bar of yellow light lay across them, and she ran a fingertip over his triangular eyebrow. He gazed up at her, then kissed her quickly on the neck, his mustache soft beneath the curve of her jaw. Sparks ran down her arms, and her lips went numb. She thought she heard a bell begin to ring. "You'll enjoy this," he said. Then he set her back upon her chair and pulled back the curtain. As the last peal echoed, the electric lights snapped off, leaving the theater black, but for the embers of distant cigars and halos upon the floor from the ushers' lanterns. Several ladies cleared their throats timidly, yet the sound resonated as though in a canyon. Then as the strings began a maudlin tune, the stage was bathed in a murky light, revealing a damp basement strewn with cobwebs and ash, where a girl in lavender rags lay asleep on a great hearth. "Cendrillon herself," whispered Nicola. And before that girl even raised her head, Adelaide's heart went out to her, and when the 3 stepsisters in high-collared gowns appeared to thrash her with the broom and berate her in song, Adelaide felt tears run hotly down the back of her throat. Of course she felt moved by poor Cendrillon, but even more so by the realization that here was Marie in the ashes come to life, a story which had once been as real to Adelaide as breakfast, yet to the bejeweled Parisians around her it was just a trifle, for never in their lives had they needed magic or a prince to save them. She held tight to Nicola's sleeve, feeling its weave beneath her nails. The sisters strutted off stage, leaving Cendrillon to sleep and dream of a ball. The most splendid oriental ball, and a fairy took the stage now, singing that the girl was her godchild, and summoning nature to her aid. Starlight for a gown, a goblin to drive the coach, and dragonflies to pull it. Cendrillon woke in the midst of this splendor, and joined in the chorus until every instrument achieved an unattainable note, and the stage fell to black. Applause from all sides. Adelaide squeezed Nicola's arm in both of hers and put her head on his shoulder, her forehead against his white collar. He stroked her cheek with the back of his hand, and she felt her hairpins shift. The electric bulb snapped to life throughout the theater, and with much clatter and rustling of papers, the audience rose in glad anticipation of cake and a glass of chocolate. The tombstones on either side peered at Adelaide and Nicola in puzzlement, as though they'd never been in love themselves and could only shrug when they stumbled across the word in a book. Adelaide bit her lip. Perhaps Nicola would not stir like the rest of them. Perhaps this moment would not have to end. She heard a buzz and a snap above their heads, and an instant later the theater was plunged into blackness. A woman shrieked. Men laughed. "The electric circuit has failed," someone announced plainly. "Bring up the gas! Light the gas!" croaked an old frog. But the gas lines had been lately removed, and the ushers had tamped their lamps, leaving the hall black as the inside of a goat. Disembodied voices floated around them. "Always been better. And if Monsieur Edison was such a genius, he'd, bring me a coffee. Now you can't see your hand. And a little pastry. What now, play moosh in the dark?" They fluttered about Adelaide like moths. She couldn't tell up from down, and could barely discern his face in the dark, though she found it was closer than she might have guessed, and here was his mustache upon her neck again. Here were his lips. She curled like a petal, and wrapped her arms around his head, put her fingers through his hair, stiff with pomade. His neck smelled of a forest. She slid from the chair to the floor. Was that arm his? Hers. Her lips found his. Her fingers found the hair curling behind his ears. She felt a silver light course through her, and knew if she were only to open her eyes from kissing, she would see beams shining from her fingertips like lighthouses. He'd wreaked a change in her very biology. It shouldn't have been possible for her small hand to take his and guide it beneath her wealth of skirts to the pearl buttons of her drawers, indeed to help him with the buttons, even as their lips were ever upon the other's mouth. And suddenly she was inundated beneath her 7 layers of crinoline, but Nicola pawed at her face to find her mouth again, and through the blackness she saw 100 damsels abreast of her, and 100 princes arrayed like a peacock's fan around the man in her arms as the last button of his suspenders relented. That's as racy as it gets in 1898.